I cite the Scranton, Pennsylvania Tribune from May 1st, 1948. The article is titled, Buddhist Monk Considers Hollywood Astonishing Place. It is written by Aileen Mosby, United Press Hollywood correspondent, and I quote, Today we relate the adventures of a Buddhist monk in Hollywood. This gentleman is the Venerable Lokanatha. He founded and heads the World Buddhist Mission. The Buddhists in Burma sent him to establish missions in America. The Venerable was invited to visit some wealthy converts who live in Rudolph Valentino's hilltop home. It has a Catholic shrine outside, and the neighbors say Valentino's ghost inside. Lokanatha evicted a snake from the guest house and moved in. His host suggested the monk hire a press agent. He did. He went on a fast, to last until Russia and the U.S. got friendly again. He drank orange juice. He slept sitting up. He meditated. This event came to the attention of the Kitchen Drinkers and Icebox Raiders Society of the Hollywood Plaza Hotel. Purpose unknown. They asked Lokanatha to judge their Dagwood sandwich making contest. They figured this would be novel, as he wasn't eating. The monk arrived in yellow robe and sandals. The Kitchen Drinkers, comics Joe Frisco, Cully Richards, Ed Duffy Tavern's Gardner, etc., asked if he was a wrestler or a jokester. The Buddhist with dignity said no. Frisco told the monk a joke. He giggled politely. Lokanatha selected Barbara Britton's sandwich, the winner. It was 8 inches high, filled with cold meats, cheese, eggs, and tomato, and topped by a 12-inch trout. Russia and the U.S. weren't any friendlier, but 10 days later the Venerable broke his fast. So his host, Gerald Buys, gave him a coming-out party. Buys invited various Hollywood people. They included a lawyer who'd drawn up Lassie's movie contract, a medium who wrote a book dictated by Valentino's ghost, silent star Mae Murray, etc. They drifted around a table loaded with grape juice, which had been sitting around in champagne bottles for 12 years. Lokanatha was introduced to the guests. Blessings, he smiled. Same to you, somebody said. The monk sat on a red sofa. He listened to a lady sing an opera aria. Later, another lady sang a song about a sweetheart of the USO who couldn't say no. Lokanatha ignored a blonde gently snoring on the sofa, with a champagne glass in her hand. He smiled. Oh, this doesn't bother me. It goes in one ear and out the other. Lokanatha next gave a speech downtown on Is Peace Necessary? He says it is. In Burma, Buddhist priests do not walk into meeting halls on ordinary pavement. Ladies fling their long hair on the sidewalk for them to tread upon. 10 Buddhist ladies did that for Lokanatha here, while camera flashbulbs popped. Most had such short hair the Buddhists almost trod upon their heads. In the middle of his speech, the Venerable was handed a note from his press agent. The Venerable had to end his speech and go backstage to have his picture taken for the papers. End speech. The Venerable says he thinks Hollywood is indeed a strange and astonishing place. End quote. Today, the Venerable Lokanatha, the Italian Buddhist from Brooklyn, and the psychic from Binghamton, New York, the Reverend Carol E. McKinstry. We explore the fated life paths of these exceptional characters in the Valentino saga. We discuss the who, what, why, and where about these 2 spiritual notables who would meet in Valentino's last home, Falcon Lair, on May 6, 1948, to bridge the ethers and channel his disembodied spirit. In this episode, we chase the ghost of Rudolph Valentino, all the way from Rangoon, Burma, to Binghamton, New York, and I file my report on the subject of Lokanatha and Reverend Carol McKinstry's ectoplasmic Valentino manifestations.
Ciao, I am Renato Floris, the very proud publisher of all the scholarly and entertaining books on Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova by Evelyn Zumaya. I'm here today with Evelyn to talk more about her fascinating work. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato. It's so nice to be here with you. Today, I address the claims of alleged communication with Rudolph Valentino's ghost, made by the Venerable Lokanatha and Reverend Carol McKinstry. Now, although I'm focusing on these two participants in Valentino's spectral history, as you know, Renato, there are endless accounts and claims made, many websites and blogs devoted to Valentino hauntings and psychic activities. This is a major aspect of his legacy. Considering there have been some 700 recorded sightings of Valentino's ghost, according to an article published in the Los Angeles Times on October 31st, 2011, Halloween, I would say this confirms the enduring interest in Valentino's etheric presence. And I cite this article from the Los Angeles Times, October 31st, 2011, and I quote, "In fact, according to Hollywood ghost lore, Valentino is one of the busiest spirits in Hollywood. Even the ghost of his beloved Great Dane, K-Bar, who died 3 years after his master, has been known to lick hands of those who pass his grave at the L.A. Pet Memorial Park in Calabasas. Valentino supposedly haunted his Beverly Hills mansion Falcon Lair, which was bulldozed in 2006. According to his ex-wife Natasha Rambova, who maintained that she was in contact with him in the afterlife, Valentino refused to believe he was dead, so he wouldn't leave the premises, visiting the corridors, his bedroom, and his stables. Veteran actor Harry Carey claimed to have come into contact with Valentino's ghost after he bought the mansion. His ghost also supposedly appeared at a vintage Hollywood apartment complex named Valentino Place. That was the site of a speakeasy the actor frequented. Other locations where the ghost of Valentino has been spotted include a beach house in Oxnard that was his home during the filming of The Sheik, a room at the Santa Maria Inn on the Central Coast, and the Knickerbocker Hotel in Hollywood. Valentino was buried in a crypt at Hollywood Forever, and his ghost supposedly has been spotted next door at Paramount, where the actor used to work. According to reports by security guards and others on the lot, Valentino visits the studio dressed all in white in his chic costume." End quote. So there's no shortage of reportage on the afterlife of Rudolph. In Affairs Valentino, I covered some of these spooky urban legends, tales of the meandering spirit of Valentino. I covered specifically the account of cowboy movie star Harry Carey. Carey rented Falcon Lair in the 1930s, and contrary to the excerpt I just read, he did not claim to encounter Valentino's ghost, but helped to debunk the idea he haunted his last home. You can read more about that in Affairs Valentino, Chapter 5, page 89. I think Valentino instigated this psychic fascination, which continues to this day. While he was married to Natasha Rambova, they both delved into the spirit world and participated in various occult activities. And they were both very public about their interest in seances and automatic writing. I wrote a book on the subject titled Astral Affairs Rambova, where I told the story of Natasha Rambova's astral communications with her dearly departed Rudy in the days after his tragic death in August of 1926. To set some historical framework for the popular acceptance of psychic activity at the time, I cite Astral Affairs Rambova from Chapter 3, titled Black Carpeting, page 19. And I quote, "In New York City in December of 1925, the services of spiritualists adept in a variety of occult activity could be retained to satisfy every price range. It was a precipitous time to be a psychic, as the hiring of someone to commune with the dead on your behalf reached the height of popularity. The timing of this phenomena has historically been attributed to the catastrophic loss of life during World War I. Over 18 million people died as a result of the global conflict, leaving millions more as relatives and loved ones of the fallen. Vulnerable in their grief and desperate to commune with deceased family members, the stricken sought comfort in the presence of mediums and psychics who claimed they could channel the dead. From the more serious mediums, such as George Wayner, to gypsies camped on the street corner, the other side practitioners were making good money as the astral plane became an acceptable and popular destination. Egyptologist Howard Carter's discovery of the Tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 charged these dabblings in the afterlife with the added intrigue of new mysteries from the land of the pharaohs. The desert sands and all things Egyptian contributed in great measure to the growing acceptance of crystal balls, tarot cards, and seances. The author of the Sherlock Holmes crime fiction detective series, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, announced he was a true believer in the occult and openly endorsed spiritualistic efforts. He owned a bookshop in London where he sold occult reading material and founded the Hampshire Society for Psychic Research. For Sir Arthur, his psychic research was of world significance, as he felt spiritualism to be a new revolution, one that could bring comfort and peace of mind to people mourning the loss of loved ones. The spiritualist movement was not without its adversaries, with American magician and self-appointed anti-spiritualist crusader Harry Houdini advertising his ability to defraud mediums. Of course, this provided advertising for his own act of illusory escape tricks. The debate raged between Houdini and Doyle, which served to further intensify popular interest. If you were not someone convinced occult behavior was the devil's handiwork, you were undoubtedly sitting in seances, gazing into a crystal ball, or having a fortune teller read your tarot cards in a small tent or a darkened room. The lure of the mysterious gripped America's imagination, with the occult contributing to the roar of the 1920s, as equally as embraced as a flask of bootleg whiskey or a bathtub full of homemade gin." End quote. While Natasha Rambova and Rudolph Valentino were married, they attended many seances together, and he, for a while, became adept at the psychic practice of transcribing the words from the deceased through automatic writing. It was in this manner he transcribed the poetry in his book of poems he titled Daydreams. But more about that automatic writing in a minute here. In Astral Affairs Rambova, we included the entire transcript of those infamous seances Rambova held with her personal psychic and deep trance medium George Wayner. Those seances were held in the Hudnut family chateau on the French Riviera in the days just prior to and after Valentino's death. Now, Rambova would publish those revelations, as she claimed Rudy called them, in the New York Evening Graphic in serialized format, with each installment illustrated by those outrageous composigraphs. For more on that, listen to our podcast episode titled Rudy's Last Picture and More. Well, imagine the public's reaction to news the recently deceased Valentino was reporting how he was walking among the living on Broadway and meeting the dead on the astral plane, such as Enrico Caruso. For me personally, I have to admit I found those revelations, well, challenging. Initially, when I read them sometime about 2003, I found them tedious and at times ridiculous. Rambova's biographer Michael Morris believed she suffered a complete nervous breakdown at the time of Valentino's death, and her publication of revelations was the result. I'm not entirely convinced of that, but Michael Morris's theory has merit. So I read the revelations again a few years later to experience pretty much the same reaction. But when I was working on Astral Affairs Rambova, I really spent time with those seance transcripts and realized that they would mean nothing at all to people who have no belief in this type of phenomena. So I decided in some moment of inspiration that I would assume a new vantage point in my approach and believe, for a while at least, that these were direct transmissions from Rudolph Valentino in the days after his death, his words delivered directly from the astral plane. Surely Natasha Rambova was not completely insane, and I found her to be a cautious and measured woman and extremely intelligent. She did not need money and had little desire for more fame. She had that. So why did she risk appearing insane by publishing those seance revelations? What was her motivation? Because she believed in them. So I read them for a third time, believing in them, and then and only then it became an enlightening and thought-provoking experience. Enlightening because from the vantage point of belief, the seance transmissions sounded credible, and I wondered how this medium, who never met Valentino, how could he go on at such length in his character? If it was indeed all faked, Renato, for some unknown and irrational reason, it was very well executed. Now, Natasha Rambova's daring claim, which she announced to the world upon her arrival in New York from France in November of 1926, was met with criticism, as would be expected, most aggressively by Valentino's first wife, Jean Acker, and by his last lover, Pola Negri, and by a woman in Binghamton, New York, a psychic known locally as the Reverend Carol E. McKinstry, president of the Universal Spiritualist Church. When Reverend Carol McKinstry read about Rambova's seance transmissions, she was living in a castle on Conklin Road just outside of Binghamton, New York. Oddly, a stone's throw from where I was born and raised. But the young Reverend McKinstry bristled at the news Natasha Rambova was divulging all to the world from Rudy's ghostly situation, and she was not about to be outdone. She set to work immediately, actually within a few weeks of Rambova's announcement, and by March of 1927, just as the installments of Rambova's revelations were hitting the newsstands in New York City, Reverend Carol McKinstry managed to grab some extensive press herself with her own brazen Valentino announcement, alleging Valentino came to her at night to dictate a movie scenario to her, and I quote the local Binghamton paper, and I quote, "No one here is particularly excited over claims that Rudolph Valentino, moving picture actor, comes back from the grave at midnight regularly and converses with Reverend Carol E. McKinstry, president of the Universal Spiritualist Church. The bunk, say some. Others smile. But there are many who are thrilled by the idea that Valentino is collaborating with Reverend McKinstry in the production of a scenario, quote, The Warning from Out the Ages, which the pastor says is intended to be a moving picture message from the great beyond and the culmination of a glorious career. It is explained that with eyes bandaged against the spiritual brightness of Valentino's presence, Mrs. McKinstry takes her post in the writing room of the nearby Corby Castle each night at 11, and from midnight until 2 o'clock in the morning, to receive Valentino's dictation from another world. The sittings began early in December and are still in progress, but the scenario is almost completed, Mrs. McKinstry declares. In the corner of the writing room, under a gauzy curtain, sits a life-size model of Buddha, an overhead light bringing the idol's features to a startling relief. Figures from China and Japan, elephants and camels from India and Egypt, lotus flowers from the Nile, and the isles of the Indian Ocean all tend to add to the air of mysticism to the surroundings. Reverend Carol McKinstry is a regularly ordained spiritualist pastor, a member of the New York State Assembly of Spiritualists and of the National Spiritualist Association. Mrs. McKinstry doesn't explain how Valentino happened to pick her out to receive messages from the beyond. She didn't know him when he was alive. Quote, The scenario is divided into 2 parts, she explained. It is a mystical tale, and while I cannot count myself a competent judge in the art of making scenarios, I get the idea that Valentino had been obsessed through all his career as a movie actor to compose a scenario and is now trying to get his message across from the spiritual world. The theme apparently is one of a man and 2 women. The leading part is a character ideally constructed for those peculiar attributes that made Valentino famous, well, in the world. All 3 are unmarried when the story begins, but marriage claims them before the end. The scene is laid in tropical cities and possesses beautiful oriental and desert scenery and is replete with those climaxes that so featured the talents of Valentino in life. Thus far he has not given me any message to his people. Indeed, I would not accept such a message at the beginning, owing to the fact, as I pointed out to him, the public would believe me an impostor. His dictation of the scenario would alone be proof to me that he is Valentino, and it will in itself stand as self-evidence of the character and name of the writer." End quote. Now, the Most Reverend Carol McKinstry would surpass Natasha Rambova by claiming this transmission from Rudolph Valentino's ghost, and she added a subtitle to the opus, A Psychic Consignment from Rudolph Valentino. So during the snowy winter of 1926 to 1927, While her husband Bill ran a struggling restaurant in Binghamton on Washington Street, Reverend Carol garnered extensive and lavishly illustrated press for her project. The images published show her seated with her blindfold in place, demonstrating her process of how she communed nightly with the ghost of Valentino. As reported about in her hometown paper on May 6, 1948, and I quote, "For the benefit of our beardless readers, Rudolph Valentino was the only man in America who could have been elected president just lying on an anthill of silk pillows and making cooing noises at the lady voters. From the second gallery of the old stone opera house to Paramount, he panicked every female over 3 and under 85, and left the word chic an indelible part of the American language. He died in 1926, and great was the wail of grief from a good part of the female population." Well, 6 years after he died, he showed up in Binghamton. That is, his ghost called on Carol McKinstry, and was, to hear the story from Mrs. McKinstry, greatly agitated. He wanted to write a book. "We wrote for 25 minutes every day," said Mrs. McKinstry. "I couldn't stand it any longer. It was exhausting." Altogether, Rudy and Mrs. McKinstry took 7 years to write the book. There was one unaccountable 3-year lapse in which Valentino simply failed to show up for work. Rudy once left Mrs. McKinstry flat, is the way a Catherine Menzies explains it in Hollywood. He broke off in the middle of a sentence, and he didn't come back for 3 years. She was furious. After all, she'd given him a lot of her time and energy to help him write his book. Mrs. McKinstry says she was living in a castle in Binghamton at the time, and Valentino picked her out as a collaborator because he was a guy who just naturally liked castles. She headed for Hollywood in 1942, and she's got an 80,000-word manuscript entitled The Return of Rudolph Valentino, which is getting a very fast brush-off from the studios. This is discouraging enough, but Mrs. McKinstry feels worse about one book publisher who wants to call it The Sheik of Araby Rides Again. Says Mrs. McKinstry, "Imagine." Mrs. McKinstry, struggling for adequate words to describe the event, finally came up with, quote, "His words appeared before me, like skywriting, just like the Pepsi-Cola ads. I hereby nominate the manuscript for the Spook of the Month Club," end quote. So yes, with her 80,000-word manuscript ready for Hollywood, she first went to Washington, D.C. to file her copyright on behalf of Rudolph Valentino. Now, I have a copy of her petition for that copyright, which was notarized on January 9th, 1939, and signed by her with this statement, quote, "To the public at large, I do hereby certify that this script, titled A Warning from Out the Ages, was received through my clairvoyant and clairaudient faculties, and scribed by my physical penmanship from the spirit of Rudolph Valentino," end quote. She appears in Los Angeles by 1942, and her ability to garner magnificent press began to pay off. Her notoriety as a psychic communing with and worshiping the dearly departed Valentino did not go unnoticed, even though she failed to secure any offers for her, or rather Rudolph's, movie scenario. She made an appointment with S. George Ullman, Valentino's closest friend and trusted business manager, and presented him with her tome. Now, he commented the following in his 1975 memoir on page 99, and I quote, "A lady came to my office many years after Valentino's passing. She had with her a bulky manuscript of a book, allegedly dictated to her over a period of time by Valentino. She identified herself as Reverend Carol McKinstry and pleaded with me to read the manuscript so that I could confirm the authenticity of these spiritual words from Rudy. Reluctantly, I promised to read her book and then get in touch with her. I read the book with care, but I couldn't detect one sentence that had any of Rudy's philosophy or any phraseology that could be identified as his. I had to tell Mrs. McKinstry the truth, but that didn't disturb her one bit. She later frequently attended psychic meetings and read portions of her book to the assembled believers." End quote. In Hollywood, Reverend Carol acquired a loyal congregation. The City of Angels was still in love with their sheik, and his fans still mourned his passing, idolized him as a god. And it was to this god Reverend McKinstry prayed her prayers and inspired her flock. She was the Valentino minister. A long way from the snowy cold woods of upstate New York, she flourished and held her services dedicated to her god, Rudy Valentino. With the establishment of her Valentino Memorial Church of Psychic Fellowship, she wrote liturgy and responsive readings, and why not? For her, a god was a god, and deserving of such worship, and the congregation came. Reverend McKinstry held forth in Hollywood. I found the following account in my archive the other day of one of her services to Valentino, or a few details of the service, and it has no cited source, but I will still read it as it is so insightful on this subject. And I quote, "Appearing in a long black caped dress and Hindu head wrap, Carol McKinstry opened each service with a poem of meditation dedicated to Valentino, and the playing of one of two of the only recordings of his voice, the Kashmiri song. After liturgical responses from the assembled parishioners, they proceeded to write 3 questions on a piece of paper for Carol's response. She psychically answered each written question without ever opening a single paper. This particular prowess was as impressive as her followers ardent." End quote. It would be 20 years after Carol McKinstry came to Hollywood, 20 years of trying to promote her or Valentino's manuscript, 20 years of leading worship services dedicated to him, when she received an invitation from a woman named Gypsy Buys and her house guest, the Venerable Lokanatha. They invited the good Reverend McKinstry to attend and participate in a seance which would be held at Falcon Lair on what would be Valentino's 53rd birthday. It stands to reason she would not only be invited, but be welcomed as an honored guest.
How did Gypsy Buys meet the Venerable Lokanatha?
Well, Renato, as this ghost story unfolds, enter Gypsy Buys. Gypsy Buys was a notorious and well-known personality in California in the 1940s. Having owned a nightclub in the San Francisco area and having founded her own line of cosmetics, she also made headlines consistently by possessing a real knack for seducing the press and a full-time press agent. Above all, Gypsy Buys was a Valentino fanatic. In 1946, she and her husband Jerry bought Valentino's last home, Falcon Lair, with the intention of locating and purchasing back all of Valentino's original furnishings and restoring Falcon Lair to the exact condition when he lived there. Now, this never came about, and Gypsy and Jerry Buys would only own Falcon Lair for a couple of years. They sold it in 1949. But in 1948, she was all about her overtly public devotion to the memory of Rudolph Valentino. And this is where the Venerable Lokanatha takes center stage.
Lokanatha really got a lot of press coverage back then.
He sure did. And I guess we begin by sharing some background information about this Italian Buddhist from Brooklyn, New York, who would live in Falcon Lair and claim to have communicated with Valentino's ghost at the infamous 1948 seance in Falcon Lair. I think his fascinating history was best articulated in an article I found in the Tampa Tribune, published on Halloween 1947, titled "Buddhist from Brooklyn to Preach in U.S." And I quote, "A one-man Buddhist mission will invade the United States shortly, bringing with it Nibbana, Pankakandha, and the atomic bomb of love. The missionary is the Venerable Lokanatha, who before his conversion was plain Salvatore Natale Cioffi of Brooklyn, where his 3 brothers and 5 sisters still are living. Lokanatha is looking forward to his first family reunion in 22 years and many fine hours of religious debate with his older brother, Monsignor Angelo R. Cioffi of St. Rosalia's Roman Catholic Church in Brooklyn. Lokanatha, who wears the traditional yellow robe and shaven skull of a Buddhist monk, first became interested in Buddhism while studying for his chemical engineering degree at Cooper Union and Columbia University. Later in his off hours from laboratory work on Staten Island, he spent many hours pursuing the subject in the New York Public Library. In 1925, he went to Rangoon and was ordained into the Buddhist faith. Lokanatha believes the time is now ripe for a resurgence of Buddhism throughout the world, and especially the United States. On his current lightning preaching tour, he will visit Shanghai, Manila, Honolulu, San Francisco, and cities all across the United States to New York. In the latter city, possibly on Riverside Drive, Lokanatha hopes eventually to erect a skyscraper pagoda dedicated to world peace. He believes there is no such thing as matter, only energy. We are each a bundle of electricity. Buddhism, Lokanatha says, is the only absolute scientific religion, and he hopes to point out its attraction to free thinkers, rationalists, and agnostics in the United States. The only way to save the world is to, quote, hitch up science with the 5 precepts, i.e., abstain from taking life, do not take what is not given, abstain from adultery, abstain from lying, and abstain from drinking. Only by detonating the atomic bomb of love can we destroy suffering born of ignorance and bring supreme bliss to this unhappy world, says Lokanatha, end quote. Prior to his arrival on the West Coast to launch his lightning preaching tour, from 1939 until 1944, he was locked in a prisoner of war camp in India. This experience nearly killed him. It is assumed the British kept him incarcerated because of his Italian heritage, thinking he would be a Mussolini sympathizer, although he held American citizenship. So he appears in San Francisco in February of 1948, and his arrival is covered in the column titled Freddie Francisco Observes, where the columnist gives a rather sarcastic review of Lokanatha's history, motives, and dress. The 5-feet-tall Lokanatha was a passionate vegetarian and often went on hunger fasts to make his points about not killing animals and world peace. And one interesting aspect of his life to me in learning about him was that his very Catholic Italian family was so unsupportive of him and his calling.
How did Lokanatha come to live in Valentino's last home, Falcon Lair?
Lokanatha appears in the news in Hollywood during the week of May 6, 1948, in the days just prior to Gypsy and Jerry Bai's seance at Falcon Lair. It is announced he is living as a house guest of the Bais at Falcon Lair. Gypsy Bais, in planning the seance, put her press agent to work and promoted the Brooklyn Buddhist by informing the press the Venerable Lokanatha received a message while in Burma, today Myanmar. This message told him that he should travel to the U.S. to spread the word about Buddhism. Gypsy Bais claimed Lokanatha received this message as a calling from none other than Rudolph Valentino. Despite Lokanatha denying this calling ever occurred, and on several occasions, which caused some embarrassment for Gypsy Bais, she held fast to this claim in the days before Valentino's birthday seance on May 6th. Her press agents skillfully orchestrated photos which were taken and distributed by wire services, such as the Associated Press. Hence, Lokanatha received coast-to-coast coverage. Especially popular were those photos of Lokanatha arriving to give a lecture while taking each step on women's hair.
What do you mean, taking each step by walking on hair?
In the week before the Valentino seance, several women, and some claimed they were hired actresses, laid prone on the sidewalk and spread their hair before Lokanatha so he would never have to step on concrete. Obviously, after this kind of outrageous press, when it was announced he was about to attempt to communicate with the dearly departed Rudolph Valentino in Valentino's last home, where he happened to be living at the time, this was breaking news. The excitement about the seance and the Buddhist priest and ardent missionary would be enhanced by the further news that his co-channeler at the upcoming event would be the esteemed high priestess of Rudolph Valentino worship in Los Angeles, the Right Reverend Carol McKinstry. So Salvatore Ciaffe and the lady from Binghamton were about to meet and hold forth. And I cite from the Daily Oklahoman May 6, 1948, from an article titled Buddhist to Attempt to Talk to Dead Actor. And I quote, "The Venerable Lokanatha, Buddhist Missionary, will attempt Thursday night to contact the late film actor, Rudolph Valentino, through the agency of 10 mediums and clairvoyants," the clergyman's press representative announced Wednesday. The press agent said the time was chosen because it is Valentino's birthday. He was born May 6, 1895, and died in August 1926. The publicist reported that one of the mediums, Miss Carol McKinstry, has been in frequent communication with Valentino's spirit. The seance will take place in Falcon Lair, Valentino's former home, which Lokanatha now occupies, end quote.
The accounts in the newspapers about the actual seance really vary.
They do, Renato, and they are a favorite topic in almost every book on Valentino. But for today's account of that seance, I read coverage by a Virginia McPherson from her column in the Ventura County Star Free Press, published on May 8, 1948, titled, "Rudolph Valentino is in the news again." And I quote, "Rudolph Valentino, or a reasonable facsimile thereof, showed up at his birthday party in his old hilltop home last night. In this social event, he had the assistance of 30 mediums. They claimed, anyway, that the departed movie idol floated on a stream of ectoplasm to the minor palace, Falcon's Lair, where he lived when he was just plain folks. His dog, Will Rogers, and a guy named Irwin, whose last name we didn't catch, tagged along for the ride. All the disappointed reporters saw was a carved Italian chair with a one-candle birthday cake perched on the seat and red roses drooping over the back. These were all of this world. But the mediums said they saw plenty of things that weren't. They said Rudy had a wee of a time. He rumba'd, tangoed, and wore at different moments riding pants and boots, a white robe, a toreador outfit, and a pair of golf knickers. One stately medium in a low-cut dress insisted he also breezed by in a blue dressing gown. She said, "I felt a pressure on my shoulder." Valentino's arrival ended a seance that the mediums put on for the benefit of Valentino's 53rd birthday and a dubious press. The spiritualists circled in the den of the dead star's home around 4 mediums seated with fingertips on a table. The table legs tapped sharply, which the medium said meant messages from Valentino. Valentino announced that current movies are lousy, that he had a message of love for humanity, and that he was very glad the newspaper people showed up, and wouldn't they come again. The ladies cooed to Valentino to raise the table off the oriental rug. They even chanted, "Raise the table, Rudy dear." The table legs stayed put. The lights were then doused, and the mediums awaited his vision, to a shaky chant of the song "One Alone." One medium whispered that his dog was sniffing around the room. Others reported him lurking in a corner with M. Rogers, knocking roses off the chair and tapping on the window with Irwin. Another guest of honor, alive, was the Buddhist missionary from Burma, the Venerable Lokanatha, who lives in the house. He conveniently was on a 24-hour word fast in honor of Valentino. He had nothing to say. One medium, Mrs. Carol McKinstry, did. She said Valentino has turned ghostwriter and dictated an 80,000-word book to her. She said the reporters couldn't see Valentino because they were too skeptical. Quote, "The vibrations," she explained, "were in conflict," end quote. So it was a toss-up whether the seance was successful or not, and of course that would be depending on whose account you heard and what one chose to believe. It was well attended by mediums and press, and a lot went on, from songs sung, poetry read, to bells tolled, and chants chanted. I quote one other article reporting on the seance from the San Francisco Examiner, and this on May 12, 1948. And I quote, "The greatest so far of projects cooked out by the Bais in their effort to help Lokanatha, however, was the seance that they held for him last week. They invited 30 mediums and 20 newspapermen and held a blowout on the 52nd anniversary of Rudolph Valentino's birth. It was a very solemn occasion. The lights were lowered and Rudy was invited to show up. Nothing happened for a while, and then a table in the room began to sway. Refreshments having been served, some of the newspaper men present were swaying too, and were unable to say later whether the table actually moved, whether the house moved too, or whether there was a table. The mediums, however, interpreted the movement and certain tappings to mean that Rudy was there, that he thought that the Venerable was a great little guy, that he wanted them all to make themselves at home and have a wonderful time. The Bais later countermanded this request, and that he would like them all to sing a chorus of the Sheik of Araby. The Associated Press reports that they did. The Venerable Lokanatha was actually the star of the show. He amazed the mediums by endorsing their statement that Rudy had been present, and added that he, too, had enjoyed a little conversation with the late movie star. He wouldn't tip anyone off as to the subject matter of the conversation. He said it was between him and Rudy, private stuff. The mediums departed flabbergasted. This was the first time that this had happened to them. And Lokanatha smiled his quiet little smile and retired to his room to read his clippings again. The Bais are delighted. Always helpful. They have booked a date at Carnegie Hall in New York. No fooling." End quote. Gypsy and Jerry Bais sold Falcon Lair, but before they vacated the premises in 1949, Carol McKinstry would attempt one more time to contact Rudolph Valentino and Falcon Lair. By then, the Venerable Lokanatha had left the United States, as he would spend only 18 months in America before leaving to continue on in his world missionary tour. With Lokanatha unavailable, Carol McKinstry would hold the second seance with Rudolph Valentino, a gentleman who lived his life somewhat as Valentino. And I cite Affairs Valentino, page 356. And I quote, "One of the more notorious Rudy applicants was discovered in Los Angeles in 1953, when police responded to a call on Hollywood Boulevard. When the door of the apartment opened, a man in full desert robes gave his name as Rudolph Valentino. He informed the police he devoted his life to Rudolph Valentino's memory. The policeman then discovered the floor of the apartment was covered in sand, and an enormous tent had been erected where several women lolled about in harem costumes. With Rudy memorabilia cramming every nook and cranny of his Hollywood desert hideaway, Valentino made the logical decision to share his fabulous obsession and opened his home to the public as a museum." End quote. I share a small article from the Los Angeles Times, February 13th, 1949, about this second seance where Carol McKinstry collaborated with Rudolph Valentino, attempting to channel Rudolph Valentino. The article is titled "Medium Tells Contact with Valentino's Spirit," and I quote, "Rudolph Valentino yesterday was offered a last chance to return to his former hilltop mansion before diamond-studded Gypsy Bais moves out. Gypsy, who has a drawer full of jewels for each day in the week, had her favorite medium set the stage for the Sheik's return to fabulous Falcon Lair, where he lived before his death in 1926. She and her financier husband Jerry are leaving Wednesday. A San Francisco group has taken over the property. They tried before, 2 years ago, to get a message through to the screen lover. At that time, mediums claimed they were successful, although some of the guests and newsmen present failed to conceal their skepticism. Yesterday's seance, as far as those not in tune with the spirit world were concerned, was equally as unproductive. While Jean Saley, cosmetics manufacturer and official hostess for the event, presided over the products of the wine cellar, the medium Mrs. Carol E. McKinstry prepared herself and guests for more serious parts of the program. Rudolph Valentino, a member of the Sons of Italy, was dressed in the late screen lover's chic costume. This, they explained, was an added touch to help persuade the film idol to return to his earthly residence. Mrs. McKinstry gave readings for her guests, while Valentino stood entranced behind her. She followed this by explaining how important the reappearance of Valentino was to thousands of lovelorn women whose only inspiration in life is the worship of his memory. The medium then closed her eyes. "Rudy is here," she said, "with a message for Gypsy Bais. He says don't despair, just keep the faith." Then the guests and Valentino went home. End quote. Now, before I move on here, A side note of interest, only 5 months later, we learned that Jerry Buys committed suicide. I think this notice of Jerry Buys' suicide from the San Mateo Times on July 6, 1949, lends some insight into who these people were. Titled, Gypsy Buys' Mate Ends Life. Gerald A. Buys, former Peninsula nightclub owner and promoter of fabulous real estate deals, died this morning in San Francisco from bullet wounds. His wife, Gypsy, said were self-inflicted out of a fear of cancer. Just go away and let a man die, Buys told police, who sought to question him. He died a short time later. The 47-year-old Buys was taken to a hospital last night with 2 bullet wounds under the heart. The Buys for a number of years operated a night spot known as Gypsy's Place on El Camino Real north of Millbrae, which burned down a few years ago. They also had a place in San Francisco. Their most recent real estate venture was the acquisition of the Jefferson Hotel in San Francisco in return for the sale of Rudolph Valentino's Beverly Hills home, Falcon Lair, to a group of persons who planned a shrine for the late movie idol. 2 years ago, they broke into the headlines with a proposal to sell their palatial Morgan mansion in Los Altos to Peace It's Wonderful Brown, a cultist follower of Father Divine. The latter sold the mansion to one Belle Silver, who turned out to be Tanya Barber of Los Angeles, who has been convicted of grand theft there." End quote.
And what happened to Lokanatha and Carol McKinstry subsequently?
Reverend Carol E. McKinstry would continue to conduct her services at her Valentino Church at the Masonic Temple Hall at 11307 Weddington Street in North Hollywood, every Sunday evening at 7:30. I think the article about her opening service there in February 1957 at the Masonic Temple to be worth sharing, as it best expresses the nature of those services. And I quote the North Hollywood Valley Times, February 9, 1957, an article titled Dedication Service at Valentino Church. And I quote, "The opening service of the Valentino Memorial Church of Psychic Fellowship, held at 11307 Weddington Street, North Hollywood, Sunday evening, was a thing of beauty. Pastor is Reverend Carol E. McKinstry. Beautiful flowers adorned the rostrum, including an enormous bouquet wired from as far east as Boston, Massachusetts. Vena Lee Berry played a piano selection from the soundtrack of Valentino's last movie, The Son of the Sheik. Mrs. Edith Elwood sang God Bless This House and My Task. Charter was presented by Reverend Ruth Feather, one of the directors of the International General Assembly of Spiritualists and pastor of the Church of Infinite Truth in San Bernardino. Don Harvey Sr. was presented with credentials as Associate Minister in the newly established church. Reverend Carol E. McKinstry amplified her claim that Rudolph Valentino was a mystic and psychic by reading excerpts from Los Angeles newspapers to the effect and quoting S. George Ullman, Valentino's agent and personal friend. The church continues its services tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. at the above address, and all spiritualists, as well as fans and friends of the late Valentino, are invited." End quote. Carol McKinstry passed away on September 18, 1963, at 77 years of age. With her obituary reporting, she had 2 sons, Donald living in North Hollywood and William living in Arlington, Virginia. Reverend Carol still managed to get some posthumous local press in June of 1973, when a documentarian from New York City tried to hold a seance in the castle in Binghamton, New York, to attempt to conjure the ghost of Rudolph Valentino on film. But they did so without proper permission. A Michael Butler's movie company was told to wait until the town council could meet and grant him official permission. Carol McKinstry's manuscript is now titled The Return of Rudolph Valentino, and incredibly, it can be purchased online. And as for Lokanatha, he had quite a spectacular life, and despite his Falcon Lair residency and communications with Rudolph Valentino in 1948, In his Wikipedia page, we find not a single mention of his calling to America by Rudolph Valentino, nor the seance with McKinstry at Falcon Lair. But in an extensive biographical article about his life and important missionary work, which is published online in the Buddhist Review tricycle.org/magazine, we find the details of his rather amazing life. Indeed, he came to America as a Buddhist missionary on what was called his lightning preaching tour, where he would spend 18 months before returning to Italy and then on to India, where his missionary work is described as feverish. In this article, his appearance in Falcon Lair is mentioned, with the comment that Jerry and Gypsy Buys created his visit as a, quote, publicity farce. Lokanatha returned to Burma in the 1960s, where he died at 69 years old. I quote the Buddhist Review article, "Although he, the Venerable Lokanatha, is almost entirely absent from the historical accounts, he was one of the most significant Buddhists of the 20th century, and his missionary efforts helped shape the practice and demographics of Buddhism into the 21st century." End quote. When Lokanatha died, his funeral was held in the great Shwedagon Pagoda in Yangon, Myanmar's most sacred Buddhist pagoda. It's an incredible building and worth Googling that. Renato, I think these stories, these personalities helped in great measure to create the foundation for the etheric legacy of Valentino. And I quote from Affairs Valentino, page 220. Rudy's open acknowledgement he participated in occult activities and practiced automatic writing only added to his post-mortem popularity. His dabbling in the other side inspired mystic leanings in many of his followers, who adamantly believed he established his presence among the heavenly host long before he ever joined them. Consequently, many psychics during the 1930s advertised their own private lines of communication with Valentino on high. They chanted his name, intoned his Holy Spirit, and a few even clacked out divine transmissions on their typewriters. From the most serious students of the arcane to ridiculous charlatans, they all attempted in one way or another to bridge the ethers and reach the soul of Rudolph Valentino. End quote. Was and is this psychic fascination with Valentino a way to keep him alive? I think this was Natasha Rambova's motivation in those seances she held on the French Riviera with her psychic George Wayner in the days following Valentino's death in 1926. And this seemed to inspire the Valentino Can Still Communicate spin-offs. It was a way to revive the momentous life of one Rudolph Valentino and suspend his glory in a sense of eternity, where everything was and is possible. It was also a way to create shrines, focal points for worship, and a legacy which extended far beyond his death. I consider these stories incredibly romantic in their inherent mysticism. The story of the convergence of McKinstry and Lokanatha. I'm not one to think she could have devoted her entire life to being a fraud and a charlatan. Not at all. She was a passionate Valentino evangelist her entire life. Perhaps she was driven by the hope that her manuscript would actually become a movie. But there's no denying she worked hard on her mission Rudy extraordinaire and demonstrated great pride in her belief. It is such a romantic scenario to me, as in a sweeping epic saga kind of way, Renato, to think of a young and untested Reverend Carol sitting in her windowless room in the castle in the wilds of upstate New York that winter of 1926, blindfolded, awaiting the arrival of the ghost of Rudolph Valentino. The snow would be falling outside, and a fireplace crackling some warmth into her room, while she sat believing she was writing for Rudolph, as his ghostly and radiant presence stood nearby, speaking to her rapidly, as she wrote into the night. Just this single scenario should prove to anyone the power of Rudolph Valentino. While on the other side of the world in Burma, in the tropical climate of Southeast Asia, Salvatore Cioffi, the Venerable Lokanatha, was immersing himself in his Buddhist path with his alms bowl in hand, and dedicating himself to a life of missionary service while meditating to the sound of the temple bells in the shade of the great pagoda. These two spiritual evangelists would meet over Rudolph Valentino, their life's paths briefly converging on May 6, 1948, in a communion of minds as they met in a seance in Rudolph Valentino's home, Falcon Lair. That to me is incredible. To non-believers, this most probably all seems silly, macabre. To the cynical, it appears to be a coalition of lunatics vying for the title of Rudy's favorite spirit summoner. But to those with an ounce of belief that Rudolph Valentino could be capable of transcending dimensions and communicating in this way, it is a fabulous story, and one which deserves some appreciation shown to the participants and their dedication. Before leaving this story today, I have a couple of comments. In one of the photographs taken of Carol McKinstry in 1927, she's seated before her crystal ball in her writing room in the castle. Next to her, she has positioned a life-size Buddha. Was this some prescient act? That 20 years later, she would be seated before her crystal ball and next to the 5-foot-tall Buddha Lokanatha? I also found it intriguing that both Lokanatha and Carol McKinstry alleged to have saved their own lives by their psychic powers. During his walk to India from Italy, yes, he did walk, Lokanatha was robbed several times, and on one occasion 2 robbers were about to slit his throat. He said he closed his eyes and generated the most loving energy and managed to overwhelm the robbers' evil. And in regards to Carol McKinstry's death threat, I quote again the local Binghamton paper. Carol said that she was threatened once by a woman beside herself with a grand passion for Rudolph Valentino. The woman, Carol said, used to cry, "Are you in love with him?" One night, Carol said, as I came upstairs from the basement, she was hiding in the shadows of the top landing. Her green eyes were blazing. I felt death staring at me. I started talking to her softly. Later, as she had coffee in the kitchen, she opened her purse and took out a revolver. "This was for you tonight," she said. Soon afterward, I heard that she had died. McKinstry later said she calmed the woman with her healing energy. In closing, I pose the question, should we so easily dismiss these events? Should we mock these sincere missionaries for their callings? Why should we? I, for one, am someone open to wild belief, and whether you personally embrace a belief or not, accepting it all with an open mind certainly makes life more illuminated. Could this be defined as the religion of Rudolph? Perhaps Valentino can communicate. Who knows? I know several people today who claim this is in fact their truth. I know an artist who feels he is her daily muse. Through Natasha Rambova, did Rudolph Valentino leave a documented account of life just after death? Did he work with Carol McKinstry to write a screenplay? Did he tell Lokanatha to travel to America to preach the practice of Buddhism? Did he communicate with him in Falcon Lair on what would have been his 53rd birthday?
I guess it will all depend on one's beliefs. And I want to add, these are great, great, great stories.
And I want to point out that we've included a link in this episode's caption to a 3-minute video about the castle in Binghamton where Carol McKinstry channeled Rudolph Valentino. It is such a neat little piece of Rudolph Valentino documentation, and I'm sure you will all find it captivating, so check that out. And yes, it is snowing throughout. I also add that I will be posting all of the images of Carol McKinstry and Lokanatha and Gypsy Buys on my blog at evelynzumaya.blogspot.com, and find this link also in the caption of this episode. For today, in closing, I want to tell listeners that all of our books, with all of our new discoveries, are available online, including Astral Affairs Rambova, with those seance transcripts. And I want to thank all of you who are so supportive and generous and intelligent in your commentary and inspiration. We are still also recording Affairs Valentino, which I am reading chapter by chapter, and the book can be listened to on our new podcast channel and on our YouTube channel. You can also find those links in the caption of this episode. So please check out all our links, which we've posted in the caption.
And as always, I say, fiat justitia ruat caelum. And for the good guys, read the book and arrivederci.